And hello once again, this is LC Lupus, and today we're going to be looking at story, narrative, in general, and all that kind of fun, jazzy stuff. Before we get into it, if you appreciate these videos that I make, and I made quite a lot of them, you can check out my books, or you can support me on Patreon, but we are going to continue on for now with the video and talk about some of the story-based stuff that we can do here. I know, very, very fun. So basically, let us first just get into the idea that right now, we're going to be talking more about story in a very, very general sense. More so story as separated from other elements of the writing that you might find in a text. So, I say here, story can be separated from other elements like the writer style, the language, and the medium, right? So, obviously, the writer style is what is the style of the writer? How is this particular writer doing their thing? What kind of method do they like to use when they do their writing? Okay, so we're not looking at that. We're not looking at the language, is it in English, is it in Afrikaans, is it in French, is it in German, whatever. Is it in, what language is it in? That doesn't matter with regard to story. And then medium as well, also doesn't really matter. The medium would be, is it a book, is it a short story, is it a film, whatever. You can kind of apply these to everything, even though you might need to change some words around. Okay, so, basically, let us look at the elements of the story. So, firstly, histoire and receipt. Basically, these are two concepts that can be used to better explain how we approach stories when we want to analyze them, right? The histoire is basically the story level, right? So, the story that is happening. The receipt is the narrative text itself, so the actual physical text. So, think about that as the actual writing. And with receipt, you can also go into various concepts like the specific word choice, the way in which language itself is used, whereas the histoire is more about the actual story that underlies that. So basically you can kind of, not really, but you can kind of see it as almost like the dichotomy between content and form, right? With histoire being more like the content, like the actual story, whereas a receipt is more like a form, it's more like the actual writing itself. So, let's have a look at some of the different things that break down a story. Like, how can you break things down to better analyze them? Firstly, events. That's quite, obvious. In a story, there are events. Events happen, right? Things happen. There are people, characters, who do things, and then those things happen. Now, they can be broken down basically into functional or non-functional events. So, a functional event is an event that is actually necessary for the story to progress, right? And then non-functional events are essentially ones that are not. Not everything in a story is purely functional. Because also, for instance, some things might be for different reasons. You do get different types of writing for different reasons. So, for instance, just think about how if you wanted to have a story in which you look at a specific type of character, right, and you're trying to build that character, right, you want characterization. If you want to do that, you might have events that are non-functional, events that allow you to just explore the character without having to do anything else, really, without having to be like, okay, something like in the plot has to happen. That you don't have to do that. You can just be like, okay, I am going to have stuff that happens that is just telling us about these people. We can just learn about these characters rather than having to actually progress the plot. So think of it like that, right? Functional, non-functional. And then within that, you get kernel and catalytic events. So basically, a kernel event is something that presents a possibility of change. It basically provides some kind of an alternative. Does a person go through the door, or do they not go through the door? Right? That is a kernel event, because once they reach the door, they have to make that decision, like the characters in the story, right? They get there, and then they have to decide what to do. So do they go through, or do they not go through? If either way, it's a kernel event, because it is basically an alternative to what can happen, right? Because events in a narrative happen in a linear fashion, however, we don't know what those decisions will be when we go in. Right, if you're the writer, you might know exactly what's going to happen. But if you're a reader, a watcher, whatever it is, however you're consuming a piece, like a story, however you're consuming that story, you are not privy to the same information that the author might have when they're actually writing the text, which means that you do not know what is going to happen. So even though there are no alternatives, the story will happen like the story happens. Romeo and Juliet always happens the same way, but you don't know how Romeo and Juliet is going to go when you first read it. You do not know, right? Then you get catalytic events, which are basically things that accompany these kernel events, and they're usually things that take place between events. They're accompanying events. Catalytic, a catalyst is something that affects change in something else. So basically, the catalytic events are the events that combine the different events together. So like the different kernel events will kind of be joined together through catalytic events. Okay, so that's events, right? Events happen in a story. Things happen, but they happen in a specific order, right? Things happen in some kind of order. It doesn't have to be chronological, but here I talk about the chronological principle. So the chronological principle is the idea that things are in a, basically the correct order, right? If things are in a specific order, like in the real world, everything is chronological, or at least within our human perception, everything is chronological, right? Everything progresses in a linear sequence, right? Today will be followed by tomorrow, which will be followed by the next day. However, in a story, you can break this chronology. You can sort of say, I am going to break the chronology, and I'm going to rather have it where it starts tomorrow, the story, and then it will do a flashback to yesterday, or to today, whatever, right? The time that a story takes place can vary and change based on a variety of factors. You can move things around and change things around as the writer, and then as the reader, you basically have to piece it together. You have to figure out what the sequence now is. What is the sequence of events now that it has been changed around? Not all stories mess with chronology. A lot of stories are very, very much sticking to a specific chronology. A lot of stories do follow the chronological principle. They'll sort of be like, the story starts where it starts and it ends where it ends. There are many stories like that. Not every story changes the time and the order and duration of things. Not every story does that. Some do it in different ways. Now, just to say, firstly, when it comes to time, and if you actually want to look at a proper discussion of time, and you are, say, studying this, and you want to go into looking at these narratological concepts, I have another video which goes very, very, very in-depth into time, where it comes to order, duration, and frequency, and also other aspects of time. You basically just have to look up like narrative on this channel, and you will find various things about like narrative time and narrative mood and narrative voice. These are all things, but this is more of an overview. Okay, so the next thing is the narrative cycle. The narrative cycle is basically what happens, but not just what happens, but how does it actually progress? Like, how does it move? So you get the idea of processes of improvement versus processes of deterioration. It's actually very, very simple. Processes of improvement. Do things go from worse to good? Not necessarily to good, but from worse to better? Or do they go from better to worse? It doesn't mean from good to bad, because it could just mean that things are a bit better than they are, but not necessarily worse. So the idea is that it's either disequilibrium to equilibrium or equilibrium to disequilibrium. So is it going from good to bad, or is it going from bad to good? In very, very simple terms. Obviously, you can get bogged down in specifics about that, and about how it's not necessarily actually good and bad, and that kind of thing. And that is very important to keep in mind, I would say. But that is something that you can look at when you are analyzing a story. Do things essentially improve, or do they deteriorate? Do they get better, or do they get worse in a story? And also, a story isn't going to just be one, cycle. It's not going to be just, it gets better all the way through. Most stories have an ebb and flow to them, right? They get better, they get worse. They get better, they get worse. And this also isn't talking about quality. This is talking about, because you could say, a story got really bad. That isn't what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is that in the story, do events for the characters and what have you get better, or do they get worse? Okay? And usually it'll be a combination, because that's how it usually goes, right? Because you'll sort of start and you'll say, okay, these characters are dealing with a lot of really bad stuff, and then they have gotten their lives a bit better, and then their lives have gotten a bit better, but now they've gotten worse again. And now they've gotten better. And now they're worse again. And now they're better. And now they're worse again. And it can kind of do the cycle going up and down many different times. So if you're analyzing a story, you can look at these narrative cycles and how they work, and they'll usually be multiple throughout a story. The shorter the story, the less likely there are to be multiple narrative levels. Some short stories, for instance, will really only contain a single concept that they're exploring, whereas, say, a novel is much, much longer. And in novels, things are constantly getting worse and improving, or kind of staying the same, but we're not going to really talk about that. Okay, now the next thing is the actant/actor. It is important to sort of keep these distinct from characters. Okay, people will sort of muddy these concepts and sort of say actor is a character. Now, I'm not talking about drama. In drama, an actor is a different thing. This is basically talking about kind of archetypal ideas. So, essentially, an actor is an entity within a story that performs a function. Actors are not necessarily characters, but they generally are. Right? Something that is not an actor, something that is not a character could still perform a function and therefore be an actor in some sort, whereas an actant is essentially a generalized figure. So when it comes to the actantial model, which is a way of looking at this, you get senders, objects, receivers, helpers, subjects, and opponents in a story. So, right, like the sender is the person that does something, the object is something that someone is going after for some reason. A receiver is someone that is taking something in. A helper is something that is assisting something else. A subject is generally, the predominant point of view, so it'll be like the primary character, and the opponent could be an antagonist. So the thing is, this is why when you get the idea of like a narrative object or a poetic object, an object can be a person in a story sense. An object doesn't mean that they're objectified. It doesn't mean that they are less of a person. It just means that they are like, for instance, think of a romantic comedy, right? The object of affection is the person. They do see them as a person. They love that person. But in the story, they are an object to be sought. An object that someone is trying to get, even though it is a person. So the word object in this sense doesn't have a negative connotation in that sense. It's kind of like with grammar, right? You get the subject, verb, object. A person can be an object. John kicked Peter. Peter was the one that was kicked, therefore Peter is the object in the sentence. So basically, that is what you can, how you can look at it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, the last little thing here is an actant can be made of more than one actor, and an actor can form part of multiple actants. So it's not like an actant equals an actor, or the other way around. And one actant can be made up of multiple actors. So think about like an actor is someone that performs a function, right? So imagine lots of characters who perform the same kind of function. They are all an actant. So think of like an army, right, in a story. If there's an enemy army, you don't actually think of the army as being made of individual people. You see the army as being a singular entity of its own. So think of it like that, right? An actant is made of more than one person, kind of thing. And then an actor can form part of multiple actants, because a single person could be a sender and an object, right? Think about like a romantic comedy, right? A character could be a subject and an object at the same time, because they are the subject in their own story, but they are also the object in somebody else's affections, and another person is also an object in their affections. So they could be both an object and a subject. Or like multiple things at once. They can also be an opponent, because they could be opposing to someone else. Say if there's a love triangle, that kind of a situation. See, so there's many of these different types of elements in a story that you can look at. And that's pretty much it for now. However, if you want to go much more in depth into the more formal aspects of narrative, there are some videos which will be labeled as being for THL2701, which are basically the ones that are about narrative time, narrative mood, and narrative voice, where I go much more in depth into those specific concepts. There is also like an introduction to narrative video that you can find for those who do want to learn more about this, all those who are also studying this and want more assistance there, because I go much more in depth. And I would really say, even though that particular video is actually aimed at a third year module, if you're in like first or second year, you can still use it, because it doesn't actually matter if it's more complex. You can just simplify it for your own essays and what have you. So yeah, so I'm going to end here. If you did enjoy this, you can, and if you want to, if you appreciate these videos I do, you can support me either by checking out my books, or you could also support me on Patreon if you so desire. And of course, you could also do the usual, the like, comment, subscribe things. Those all help. So, yeah, that's about it. I hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and goodbye.